What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Wayfinder, a third-person action RPG that released in its full version late last year, though started its life as an MMO in early access. It's clearly had quite a bit of a journey, but to get my usual stuff out of the way first, I review games after 100% all the time, mostly to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a video linked in the description below covering everything I go over, and what's more, my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the particular case of Wayfinder, the achievement list is pretty straightforward, but not particularly exhaustive of the game's content either, as there's all sorts of progression and whatnot that's not really included in there. But barring that mention, it's a pretty straightforward 100%, not very difficult at all. Probably also worth a bit of an explanation here that I did not get a review copy for this, which is probably unsurprising given that the game released in its 1.0 version all the way back in October, before I bought it to take a look at it in November. Though the game first got onto my radar when the developers, Airship Syndicate and their at the time publisher, who later dropped them when the early access didn't go so well, contacted me to ask if I would like to try out the MMO version, which I ultimately turned down because I'm not really interested in covering MMOs. So it was its late game switch to a proper third-person action RPG that could be played entirely single player that drew my interest. So when it comes to talking about this game, that's probably the biggest thing. If you thought this was an MMO or all of that stuff, it no longer is, as they kind of did a hard pivot there in early access after a rough outing as an MMO, before all of that was ultimately scrapped, the monetization removed, and it is simply being sold as an action RPG for relatively cheap, like $25. And by all accounts, they seem to have turned it around. And that's kind of what I want to dig into with this review, because I think while that is true, it's also a game that you can tell wasn't exactly developed with a lot of this stuff in mind, as certain mechanics and things can feel clunky or just outright useless, like there's a mount system that is just entirely unnecessary. So there's that. But with that out of the way, let's dive into this and talk about the technical side of things. So when it comes to speaking about this in particular, it's probably worth mentioning that the entire game can be played as a co-op game if you want to, or entirely single player if you prefer. And to that end, your experiences are going to vary specifically based off of that alone. And I personally played it entirely single player, didn't really mess around with the co-op too much, so I can't speak really about the stability of that system overall. But playing solo on my own, I didn't really encounter any significant technical problems. On occasion, I would get a little bit of stuttering, which seemed to be as things were loading in, and sometimes a couple of the characters would get stuck on terrain and I'd have to just teleport away. But beyond that, it was pretty good with just some minor issues to note. And while I have seen a few reports of performance problems over on Steam reviews, they don't seem particularly widespread at the very least, so it's hard to say if you'll run into anything at all, as for the most part, seems to be doing decent in that regard. But that brings us to difficulty. So difficulty is an interesting thing to talk about with this game because just recently in a patch they added an extra difficulty called Nightmare Mode, which, to be honest, I don't love the implementation of. So for the normal game, outside of Nightmare, you've got Story to Heroic, and as you move through these difficulties, as expected, enemy health and damage adjusts accordingly, and I believe on the higher difficulties, even your damage gets reduced a little bit. But the thing is, that's really more of a per expedition type of thing. So this game has instances or dungeons, as you could call them, known as expeditions or hunts, and you can take those on, and the difficulty is kind of for those runs, and you can change it pretty freeform otherwise, even in the outdoor world zones. Meaning, of course, that difficulty is, again, just very freeform in everything outside of Nightmare. Now, the problem with this is that all of the progression and everything in the base game is geared towards making progress with all of the available characters and building it up. Nightmare, on the other hand, is an entirely standalone version of the game that is more difficult and confined to other people purely on Nightmare mode, while at the same time adding rewards to just that mode. So if you want to enjoy Nightmare Mode, you have to play, again, entirely separately from the rest of the game, where things like matchmaking, etc. is going to be limited, and the progress that normally accumulates with everything you do is limited, again, just to Nightmare Mode. With the exception being that once you unlock that mode's exclusive rewards, they'll be available everywhere, provided you want to go through the headache of doing that. But simply put, I don't think Nightmare Mode is implemented in a way that is particularly interesting, as it seems to run pretty counter to the design and overall progression of everything else in the game. So there's that, but otherwise it's pretty freeform, especially when you start getting into the mutators and things that you can add to dungeons to customize them and add unique elements to further increase or I guess decrease that challenge based on your difficulty. Now, while this game does not have a proper character creation, so to speak, it does have some unique things worth mentioning in that regard. So overall, the game has a total of 8 playable characters that you can largely swap to as you please, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the progression portion of the game, but at the beginning, you pick one of the 3 available starting characters. A short ways into the story, you'll unlock those other 2 that you could have picked, and then through various events that will come up during the story as a failsafe, but also can potentially be unlocked otherwise, you will unlock the other 5 available characters as well. Each of these characters has their own play style and stuff, as you might expect, but what's more, each of them can be greatly customized in terms of like skins and cosmetics and whatnot, which is about as close as you're going to get to a character creation. In fact, reaching max character level with any one of these guys or maxing out their base stats via awakenings unlocks like a full body transformation skin for them. And I just wanted to mention that because a lot of things that you would expect to be monetized beside something like a free-to-play MMO or anything like that have just been baked into the base game as unlockables here, which is part of that transition from an MMO to a single-player title that I think was worth mentioning. So there's a ton of customization and whatnot, but no proper character creation in the traditional sense, as the characters are all technically set. From there, though, let's talk story setup and my thoughts on it. And simply put, I found the story a bit underwhelming. It's very like traditional MMO type stuff where there's some big crazy threat called the Gloom that has destroyed most of the world. In fact, our characters, the echoes that we can swap between, all died fighting it before being brought back from their death by a character named Omen and the team at Skylight, who were able to preserve basically their small town, but the Gloom is still spreading and they are looking for ways to put a stop to it that ultimately we are of course spearheading. So like a great many MMOs, I would say it's mostly just a vehicle to the gameplay more so than it is a terribly interesting story in a lot of cases, and frankly it's pretty run-of-the-mill, and that's to say nothing of the structure of things like side quests, which tend to be fetch quests where you go into the individual expeditions or dungeons over and over again to collect certain items and then bring them back to the quest giver. And while it's not universally true, there are a couple of areas in, I would say, the second zone called Frostmarch that have some interesting quest lines and stuff. So at best, I would say it's okay, but not a particularly engaging main story, at least as far as I'm concerned. But that does bring us to a very large chunk of the game, which is its myriad of progression systems. So progression plays a pretty big role in a game like this, and there is a ton of it. In fact, I would say one of the things this game does really well is providing a consistent level of progression where no matter what you're doing, it always feels like something is moving along, which is why I think something like Nightmare Mode, which largely resets a lot of that progression into a separate game mode, doesn't feel great. But let's talk a little bit about what that is. Now, as I already mentioned, you can freely swap between, as you unlock them anyway, the 8 base characters. Each of these individual characters has a potential max level of 30, and along the way, they will gain individual bits of progression, as you might imagine, which will break down, but are things like upgrades to their basic abilities, unlocking those abilities on top of affinities or passive upgrades, and then individual equipment they might be using, etc. And that's to say nothing of their specific gear bonuses as well. Then we have our Wayfinder rank. Your Wayfinder rank is more of like an account level, so to speak. So it is a rank that you will get outside of each of the individual characters, which also has a max of 30. But for each level of a Wayfinder rank that you gain a bunch of passive benefits to every character, including benefits to, of course, things like their base stats, damage on weapons, etc. So basically, the higher your Wayfinder rank, the stronger your base level characters will be, even if you haven't leveled them up. But as those characters level up, they'll gain access to their abilities. Each character has set abilities, so you'll unlock those first, and then you can start upgrading set abilities for a little bit as well, which will increase what they do, of course, and you won't be able to fully max out every ability a character has. You will have to make some choices here. This is kind of what is loosely defined as a build, because despite all this progression, I would not say there is a shocking amount of build variety or anything, given that each one of these characters plays a fairly specific way, at least in terms of what their abilities do. So while you can mix and match that with things like what weapon they are using and pretty granular control over their stats, which we'll get into, build variety is otherwise a little light. Now, as a character levels up and we increase their Wayfinder rank, we can also gain affinities. Affinities are effectively passive bonuses to one of 3 trees like Focus or Instinct, And what this does is increase the benefit you get from certain stats on individual items. Basically, every stat on an item is associated with one of those disciplines or groups, and based on which affinity you rank up, you'll gain not only increased benefits from those items, but you'll also unlock passive abilities as well, further differentiating what you're doing to a little bit. On top of that, we then have gear. So each individual character does have a host of armor sets that they can find, and while these do have stat bonuses and things like that they can improve on your character, they are not quite as impactful as the rest of your gear, which is your weapons and your accessories. These play a very large role in what you can do. Now, weapons obviously decide both how your character attacks, but also aren't restricted by character or class or anything, meaning that any character can equip any type of weapon, which will then, of course, either work well or maybe not so well with that character's individual abilities, and you have some leeway to mess around and experiment there. Now, accessories, on the other hand, are up to 3 things you can equip that can potentially be portions of a set, and if you equip a set of them, you naturally get bonuses to various things that set increases, potentially maximizing your benefit from them. But otherwise, these accessories will increase certain stats, which is really exemplified on the echoes side of things. So both your weapon as well as all of your accessories on top of your base character that you are playing has a bunch of echo slots. Echoes will drop off of enemies, have a level associated with them, and increase a whole host of stats. You're going to slot these into your character as well as your items, as I mentioned, where they will allow you to increase specific stats. These can then be recycled by destroying echoes to gain dust and upgrading the other echoes you are using to get even more benefit out of them. And all of these echoes are divided into different types, which will only slot into certain types of echo slots. Some of these, known as, I believe it's rush slots, are special abilities granted from boss echoes you get from defeating hunts or specific bosses that you can fight, and these typically come with some sort of extra ability or something that can proc based off of something your character might do, like simply being hit by an enemy or dodging in a certain direction, things like that. So echoes play a very large part of progression, but they also allow a very granular amount of control over the stats you are increasing as well, which I enjoyed. Now, the other big part of progression, though, are awakenings, which affect individual characters as well as your weapons. Weapons, I would say, are really important to awaken, but basically these are upgrades you can make to certain types of weapons. Each weapon in the game is divided into types and, like what kind of weapon it is, guns, marksman, various two-handed weapons, sword and board, that kind of thing. But what's more, within those general distinctions, each individual weapon also has like a name. So for instance, a two-handed axe I really enjoyed was called Typhoon. Typhoon is a very specific type of two-handed axe, and you'll find upgraded versions of it as you play through the game. That is to say, increased rarity and level. Now this is important because each of those individual weapons has a specific weapon ability that you'll charge up by using it in combat before being able to activate. So in addition to simply picking a weapon type you would enjoy, you also then within that weapon type need to pick a specific weapon variant with the weapon ability that you enjoy using the most. Now it is these variants that you are able to awaken and upgrade. This effectively allows you to increase the base stats and things on that weapon, making it better for every character that uses it, no matter where you got that particular version of it from. Meaning that, using that Typhoon Axe example, every Typhoon Axe will have a same level of awakening that I have unlocked up to that point. Now you can also awaken your individual characters by going and speaking to Omen at our main base and providing a significant amount of materials. We can also upgrade the base stats of individual characters, which will also give us access to things like extra cosmetics for that character and more affinity points to upgrade their stats with, basically making them stronger at a base level. That said, this is pretty resource heavy. It's not exactly difficult to grind out those resources, especially in the end game, but it is fairly time consuming, which is probably one, I would say, criticism I have of some of these progression systems, is that the awakening costs for weapons and individual characters is significantly high. Now for weapons it kind of makes sense because all of your 8 characters could use those weapons, potentially making that a significant upgrade every time you manage to pull it off. Whereas for awakenings on your characters, those are only in effect when you're using that specific character, and having enormous resource costs for this just doesn't really seem to serve much of a point in what is otherwise a single player game. Personally, I would have loved to see those reduced a little bit, but at the end of the day it's not that big of a deal, but something to know to be sure. Now finally, for progression, all of that I just mentioned culminates in your power level. Your power level is like a general, as you might imagine, estimation of your character's power. This is going to tell you roughly whether or not you are where you should be to be taking on certain bits of content. Expeditions and things like that will give you a power range. Some of these are pretty wide because they're intended to scale a certain amount to you, others are more set in stone. Now once you reach the end game and start grinding for materials and whatnot, to finish out your progression, this will top out somewhere around 5,000. Depends a little bit on your exact setup, but right around there, give or take a little bit. But at this point, you'll pretty much just be grinding certain bosses, expeditions, that kind of thing, and fully engaging in the combat system. But before we get into all that, we first need to talk about the gameplay and world setup of this one. So Wayfinder is interesting in the sense that a huge chunk of the game takes place in its almost roguelike expeditions or dungeons where we'll assign mutators or modifiers to it to both experience a specific dungeon, but also with these extra effects we can add. However, that's not all of the game. Rather, we have a main city called Skylight, and then 3 zones you'll unlock over the course of the story. The first one, the Highlands, the second one, Frostmarch, and then lastly, the Crucible. Each of these individual areas does have an explorable zone, as you would expect, and you can run around, engage in events, find secrets, fight enemies, do some quests, the usual stuff. And while these areas certainly won't blow you away, some of them are better than others. I think in total I would say Frostmarch is probably the most well done in terms of running around and finding events and things, because this can lead you to like world boss-esque type of characters that you can fight and then get extra rewards from, like some of the cosmetic mounts even. Now ironically, I do think the mounts are useless. Zones like the Highlands and the Crucible simply aren't large enough to need mounts, especially since you can fast travel to certain points anyway. And Frostmarch, which is large enough to actually utilize mounts, has so many enemies you're likely just not going to engage with it very often, especially when certain portions of the map have like zip lines and stuff to get up and down large ledges and whatnot. So there's just not a whole lot of point to the mounts, and because of that, some of the systems that are kicking around from this game's days as an MMO don't exactly make a ton of sense in the current iteration, but are just sort of leftovers from that time in development. Now otherwise, there's a decent amount we can get up to outside of the dungeons and whatnot, and this is things like jobs and some side quests. So jobs open up fairly late into the story, surprisingly, but are just general things you can do as basic quests to get some currencies and things to turn in for cosmetic rewards or just other little stuff. Now, none of these quests are particularly engaging, as you might imagine, but there are larger side quests you can undertake, and while some of them are okay, a lot of them just send you into dungeons to do basic stuff and come back, and sometimes the structure of these is bafflingly bad, like the ones that take place in certain expeditions, which force you to go in and out of them like in excess of 10 plus times, some of which are based on RNG of whether or not the character that you need for that quest even spawns in that time, which is incredibly annoying. Now the final area, the Crucible, does start implementing some other mechanics with things like a grappling hook in the form of their hook shot, which will let you jump around the map a little bit, which I thought was a novel idea, but comes so late in the game, basically after the main story is over, in a sort of almost epilogue situation where you don't get a ton of time to mess around with it. So basically, outside of the main area, which is to say hunts and expeditions you can do, there are these explorable zones that add a bit to the game but can feel a little strange in their implementation, just due to the nature of what this game is at this point. But let's talk about those hunts and expeditions. Expeditions are effectively roguelike dungeons, more or less, that are procedurally generated based on which one you are using. Then we have hunts. These are effectively boss fights that you can add modifiers to as well, or take on as just straight up boss fights. All of these have that power level range associated with them, which for the most part are pretty tame until you get to the end of the game, really, with your mythic hunts. Mythic hunts are amped up versions of the boss fights that are much more difficult, but have much more increased rewards, potentially up to level 40 weapons as an example. And you're going to have to do some of those in order to complete the bounties for them, or quests to take on those bosses with specific mutators to gain mythic essence to awaken your characters and weapons. Now the mutators are where things get interesting. You start by only being able to add one, and then later on you can actually start adding several, up to a maximum of 3. But basically, the game has a few different mutators like greed, solar, shadow, etc. that you can add on to a game or a run here to affect it in some way. Each of them has specific effects, and they even combine with each other to make unique stuff, which are then elements and whatnot that you'll have to engage with in order to complete it. So for solar, for instance, fire patches will show up. For chaos, they'll start throwing bombs at you randomly, and they're decently fun for what they are. But that's as good a place as any to start talking about combat specifically. Combat feels pretty good in this game, actually. I do wish the build variety overall was more interesting, but there is enough here to keep you actively engaged for a good bit of time, probably like 40-60 hours if you want to do everything. So it's certainly not all bad by any means. Now, right away, it's worth a mention that our 8 characters can be divided into 3 different subtypes: a War Master, a Survivalist, or an Arcanist, which gives you a general idea of what they're all about. For instance, Arcanists do fantastic damage, but tend to be a little less survivable than, say, Survivalists, as you might imagine. So Survivalists are, of course, easier to keep alive, but also deal really solid damage at the same time. And then you have your War Masters, which can be a bit more tanky and even deal really great damage if you lean into it, but don't always have as good of movement options as the other 2, as an example. So there's some interplay just there, in addition to just what character you happen to be playing. But then we have our weapon and abilities. As I mentioned, each character has their own abilities. We get a weapon ability based on that as well, and those 2 combine to make a general playstyle for each individual character. And learning the ins and outs and what works for you there is where you're probably going to enjoy the game the most. But I would say most of them feel surprisingly good, even if they don't necessarily seem like something you'd want to engage with initially. Now, I tried all these different characters, but I want to talk specifically about the stuff that worked for me and the stuff I enjoyed the most. But as each of these characters engages in combat, they'll eventually build up to their ultimate ability, which tends to be a large AoE damaging ability, with of course some differences in how they go about things. And then each character has access to a host of different potions. These potions will provide buffs, of course, and then your basic heal potion, which can keep you from completely dying, even if you're playing a character that doesn't have a whole lot of healing options otherwise, such as Grendel. But with that, let's talk about some specific examples. So the 3 characters I wound up liking the most for each individual subtype are Grendel, Venomous, and Kairos. So Grendel, my main character towards the end to be sure, your giant beast guy who reminded me of the Char from Guild Wars 2, has a bunch of melee-oriented abilities. A shockwave he can send out, a leap, a whirlwind that has its own resource that you have to build up by using other abilities, and then an ultimate that is a rage ability that increases all of your damage and whatnot. This guy felt great naturally then with like a 2-hander, but if you wanted to, you could put a gun in his hands and mess around with that. But the reason I liked this guy so much is mostly just because I thought he looked really cool, but also because a lot of his attacks felt really weighty, in addition to a mechanic called Heat of Battle, which increases the damage dealt with subsequent hits, which allows things like Whirlwind to quickly ramp that up. So I could stack that bonus really high, but that came at the expense of less healing options in general, even though I could get some by activating things like my ultimate rage ability. And it took me a while before I settled on the Typhoon Axe's weapon ability, which is like this big wind-up slam attack, in terms of how I wanted to play around with that style. But while that was fun, I think probably my best character overall wound up being Venomous, an alchemist who throws around poison and damage over time abilities to hit enemies. She was basically my boss killer. Anytime I was struggling with a boss, I would switch over to her, and she could usually destroy things absolutely no problem. She feels best with a gun, I think, but basically any attack she does applies venom to the enemy, which then starts ticking off a damage over time effect. Now, she has abilities that drop poison clouds that can heal you while damaging enemies, and then abilities that consume those poison clouds on the ground for extra damage or healing and the like. And then her ability applies sort of a super dot to the enemy that could deal even more damage. And because of her ability to heal herself while also doing really above average damage with all of her damage over time effects, she just became a character that was really great at killing bosses for me. But then still yet we have Kairos, the Arcanist I enjoyed playing. So Kairos was an incredible damage dealer, but he was a bit of a glass cannon. He was much less survivable than the other 2 I enjoyed playing, but by far and away had the strongest damage. In fact, if I set it up properly, I would get him to crit for like 50,000-60,000 at a time where even my higher power level other characters like Grendel were only hitting like 20k. Now, this is a little bit balanced by the fact that in order to get a lot of that damage, Kairos has abilities that are more melee-oriented or general mid-range AoE type stuff, and because of that, it was hard to play him at a distance at which he was truly safe. So a lot of playing with that character came down to the skill of not dying all the time, basically. So his inability to take a hit or heal any sort of damage meant he was great for clearing out trash mobs and things like that, and while his damage was incredible, he usually just didn't have the ability to last in a prolonged fight with like a boss or something, which is where I would switch out to someone like Venomous or just Grendel more generally. And I wanted to use those examples as just ways you could interact with this combat system while freely swapping in between these individual characters, which I thought was pretty engaging for what this game is. And while it is a little light, again, on build variety comparatively to other games in this genre, if you're fully engaging with the systems and, the progression side of things, I do think it is a lot of fun. But that does finally bring us to the Steam Deck performance. So this game is in fact verified on Steam Deck, and unsurprisingly then plays pretty well there with things like controller support. Obviously, it's not a terribly graphically intensive game, but the main thing I wanted to mention is that when the game initially launched, it had some trouble with resolution, and that was patched with a fix, but I still see some people occasionally running into it or mentioning that it's a problem for them, even if I didn't experience it personally. And that issue is just that people could run into, again, resolution issues on the Steam Deck where they would have to change the game to 4K basically to allow them to actually go in and then mess with the options. So they could enable setting the resolution for internal and external display, which would then fix it overall. So there was that. They also recommend you don't install this to an SD card, as that could cause a bunch of lagging over there. And you still see like the stuttering and frame rate dips in large areas as things load in that you also see just on PC generally. So it's certainly not a perfect experience by any means, but I can see why it's verified because it's very playable in every other sense. And that finally brings us to our positives and negatives before we wrap this one up. So on the positive side of things, I really enjoyed the game's overall approach to things like progression systems, the general gameplay loop, and the ability to modify specific expeditions and boss fights and things with just little gameplay elements that mix up the formula, adding extra objectives or mechanics to any individual fight, which has its own mechanics as an example, could be really fun. And it really is where, in my opinion, the game is at its best. Now, on the flip side of that, the negative of this game is perhaps unsurprisingly then a lot of the clunkiness associated from when this game was starting as an MMO. And the transition therein kept some of those elements in, I would say, a less than intuitive way. For instance, a lot of the side quest structure is woefully unfun. I think a lot of the main quest is largely forgettable. And I also think there are even smaller things that could use an overhaul as well. Like loot management tends to be a bit of a nightmare because the game is pretty bad about telling you what weapons and things are equipped to individual characters, which are all kept in your inventory at the same time. And while for echoes they will actually tell you exactly who is using what, for some reason that system doesn't extend to things like accessories and weapons, which can make managing all of that for 8 different characters a nightmare. And that's to say nothing of how nightmare mode was implemented. So I think there's a lot of just strange little decisions on the fringe of things that can get in the way of enjoyment, which ultimately brings me to my conclusion. While this game does have a handful of things that are frustrating or don't exactly feel fleshed out, reality is this game is selling for full price $25, which is cheap, at least for what you are getting, which is a game with a whole host of systems, great progression, fun combat, all of which can be played with friends via co-op and whatnot. And because of that price, I think the game's rough edges are much more palatable. So while the game certainly does have its problems, some awkward moments, some janky systems from its time through early access and honestly, just straight up genre transition it went through, it is at its current form and price point a really great value for what you're paying for, while at the same time getting rid of all of the microtransactions, the weird monetization that MMOs tend to have in terms of cosmetics and stuff. So all of that's gone. It's just the flat price of $25. It's even on sale right now for like 40% off, which makes it like $15. So while I would consider this game far from perfect, its core loop is very fun and it's affordable. And for that reason, it gets a buy out of me, which is where we're going to wrap up this particular review. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.